Before marriage certificates. Before kings and kingdoms. Before written law told people how to love, raise children, or bury their dead, there was family. But not the kind you're imagining. The humans who lived in Africa 300,000 years ago didn't have nuclear households or patriarchs passing down land. What they had was something far more complex, more cooperative, and more successful than anything that came after. And we're only now beginning to understand how it actually worked. For most of human history, we got the story wrong. Anthropologists in the 19th and early 20th centuries assumed early humans lived like Victorian families: husband, wife, children, strict roles. They projected their own world onto ancient bones and tools, and that version stuck. It was taught in textbooks, illustrated in museums, accepted as fact. But over the last few decades, discoveries across eastern and southern Africa have dismantled that narrative. From the Homo Valley in Ethiopia to the caves of South Africa's rising star system, evidence now shows that early African communities didn't organize themselves around hierarchy, ownership, or male dominance. They organized around cooperation, around shared care, around kinship that went far beyond blood. This is the story of how the first families actually lived and why it matters that we finally tell it right. Let's start with structure. The basic social unit wasn't the isolated family. It was the band, a fluid group of 25 to 50 individuals, sometimes more, connected through kinship, alliance, and mutual dependence. These weren't rigid tribes. Membership shifted. People moved between bands based on season, resource availability, marriage, and personal choice. Genetic evidence from ancient DNA confirms this. Early African populations show patterns of gene flow that only make sense if people were constantly moving, mixing, and reforming social ties. Inside these bands, children weren't raised by two parents alone. They were raised by many. Anthropologists call this alloparenting, shared caregiving across the group. Grandmothers, aunts, older siblings, unrelated adults all played active roles in feeding, teaching, and protecting the young. This wasn't just cultural. It was survival. Fossil records show that early humans had long childhoods. A young Homo sapiens wouldn't reach full independence until their mid-teens. No single pair of adults could sustain that burden while also foraging, toolmaking, and defending against predators. So the group stepped in. And this created something powerful: children who belonged to everyone. Elders who were valued, not sidelined. Women who weren't isolated in motherhood. Men who contributed to collective care, not just provision. It was a system designed for resilience. Now, let's address a myth that refuses to die: the idea that men hunted, women gathered, and everyone stayed in their lane. The evidence says otherwise. Archaeological sites across Africa, Olorgesailie in Kenya, Blombos Cave in South Africa, reveal toolkits that show no gender division. Both men and women used cutting tools, hunting implements, and processing equipment. Isotope analysis of ancient teeth confirms that both sexes consumed similar diets, including meat. Ethnographic studies of modern hunter-gatherer groups, many of whom live in ways similar to early humans, show women participating in hunts, especially net hunts and drives, where cooperation mattered more than brute strength. Men gather. Women hunt. Roles overlap. And there's more. Burial sites from later Stone Age Africa show women interred with tools, ornaments, and ochre, symbols of status and skill. These weren't passive figures. They were decision-makers, knowledge holders, spiritual leaders. In early African societies, your value wasn't tied to your gender. It was tied to your contribution. Can you gather medicinal plants? Track animal migrations? Read the stars? Teach the young? Then you mattered. This flexibility wasn't progressive politics. It was practical survival. And it worked for hundreds of thousands of years. Fire changed everything. But not just because it cooked food. Fire created time. It extended the day into the night. It created shared space where work stopped and connection began. Around these flames, the first families gathered not just to eat, but to teach, to plan, to remember. Archaeological evidence from sites like Sibudu Cave shows organized hearths surrounded by carefully arranged sleeping areas made from medicinal grasses. These weren't just survival camps. They were homes. The hearth was the anchor. And around it, language likely evolved from practical commands, run, watch out, to the abstract. This is where the first stories were born. Where knowledge became culture. Where families became communities. Fire didn't just light the darkness. It lit the human mind. But as groups grew and spread across the landscape, a problem emerged. How do you keep families connected across distance? The answer lies in these tiny objects. At Blombos Cave, dating back 75,000 years, archaeologists found sea snail shells, each carefully pierced to be worn as beads. These weren't just jewelry. They were a visual language, a form of identity. Think of them as the world's first social network. These beads signaled who was part of your family, who was a trusted ally from a neighboring band. They created bridges across hundreds of miles of territory, ensuring that in times of drought or danger, you had people to turn to. This is sophisticated social thinking. The kind that requires planning, symbolism, and trust built over generations. Early Africans weren't just surviving. They were building relationships that could outlast any individual life. And those relationships were the real technology that allowed humanity to thrive. One of the most profound ways we understand early family life is through how they treated their dead. At Rising Star Cave in South Africa, researchers discovered remains of Homo naledi, a hominin species that lived around 300,000 years ago. The bodies were placed deep inside the cave system, in hard-to-reach chambers. This wasn't accidental. It was intentional. They were burying their dead. Not just any dead. Their family. Their group. This behavior appears across early human sites. In Border Cave, South Africa, archaeologists found the burial of an infant, carefully placed and covered with ochre and a pierced shell, a gesture of care, of mourning, of love. These rituals tell us something critical. Early Africans understood belonging. When someone died, the group didn't abandon them. They honored them. They remembered them. This suggests emotional bonds that went beyond utility. These weren't just survival partnerships. They were communities. And here's where it gets even deeper. Oral traditions from groups like the San people of southern Africa, whose ancestors have lived in the region for over 100,000 years, speak of ancestral presence, of the dead guiding the living, of kinship that transcends death. While we can't directly link these traditions to Paleolithic practice, they offer a window into continuity. Into the possibility that the emotional architecture of early African life, grief, memory, reverence, has echoed forward through millennia. So if the evidence has been there, why did it take so long to see it clearly? The answer is uncomfortable, but necessary. For over a century, the study of human origins was dominated by European and American scholars who interpreted African prehistory through their own cultural assumptions. They saw hierarchies because they lived in hierarchies. They saw male dominance because they assumed it was natural. They saw the nuclear family because that's what they knew. And when evidence didn't fit, like egalitarian burials, or tools that showed no gender split, they explained it away or ignored it. This wasn't malicious. But it was biased. Colonial frameworks also played a role. African societies were often portrayed as primitive or frozen in time, which meant their social structures were dismissed as simple or chaotic, rather than studied as sophisticated and adaptive. Even the language mattered. Terms like tribe and clan carry baggage. They imply backwardness, lack of organization. But when archaeologists describe European prehistory, they use words like communities and networks. It wasn't until African scholars began leading excavations, publishing research, and challenging old narratives that the picture started to shift. People like Dr. Johannes Haile Selassie in Ethiopia. Dr. Himla Sudyal in South Africa. Dr. Mary Leakey, who spent decades in Tanzania uncovering hominin behavior. They asked different questions. They saw different answers. And slowly, the story changed. Here's the part that should humble all of us. Everything we think of as modern social behavior, cooperation, empathy, shared responsibility, complex communication was already present in early African groups. Language, for example. We know from skull structure and DNA that Homo sapiens had the physical capacity for speech at least 300,000 years ago. But capacity isn't the same as use. What drove the development of language? Social complexity. You don't need elaborate speech to hunt alone. But you do need it to coordinate a group, negotiate alliances, teach abstract concepts, pass down stories, resolve conflicts without violence. In other words, family life, the messy, beautiful, complicated act of living together, may have been the engine of human cognition. Not competition. Not warfare. Not dominance. Cooperation. And the archaeological record backs this up. Tools become more refined. Art appears. Symbolic thought emerges: beads, carvings, ochre decorations. All of this requires a stable social environment where knowledge can be shared, experimented with, and passed down. Early African families weren't just surviving. They were innovating. And they were doing it together. Around 70,000 years ago, small groups of humans began leaving Africa. They carried tools, yes. Knowledge of fire, clothing, shelter. But more importantly, they carried social technology. The ability to form alliances. To care for the vulnerable. To negotiate, teach, and trust beyond immediate kin. These weren't inventions that happened in Europe or Asia. They were African inheritances. Genetic studies show that every non-African population today descends from a small founding group, likely just a few hundred individuals who crossed out of the continent. And they succeeded, not because they were physically superior, but because they were socially sophisticated. They knew how to work together. This is one of the most important, and least celebrated, facts of human history. When humans encountered Neanderthals in Europe, they didn't outcompete them through strength or brain size. Neanderthals were strong. They were smart. But Homo sapiens had something else: flexible, cooperative social structures inherited from Africa. And that made all the difference. So when you think about ancient African families, don't imagine isolated survival. Imagine the blueprint for every human society that followed. Understanding the first families forces us to rethink what it means to be human. Cooperation came before competition. Care came before hierarchy. Community came before cities. The nuclear family, 2 parents, isolated in a home, is a recent invention. For most of our existence, family was fluid, communal, and expansive. And in many parts of Africa, it still is. When a grandmother raises her grandchildren, that's not dysfunction. It's continuity. When a community shares childcare, that's not strange. It's ancient. Western models of family aren't universal. And they aren't superior. Africa didn't just give the world its first people. Africa gave the world its first us. There's a question we haven't asked yet: why does getting this story right matter? Because history shapes how we see ourselves. If you believe humans are naturally selfish, you build societies around competition. If you believe humans are naturally cooperative, you build societies around care. For too long, the story we told ourselves about early humanity was one of struggle, violence, and survival of the fittest. And that story justified colonialism, exploitation, and inequality. If that's how we've always been, the thinking went, then that's how we should be. But the evidence from Africa tells a different story. It tells us that for hundreds of thousands of years, humans thrived not by dominating each other, but by supporting each other. Not by hoarding resources, but by sharing them. Not by isolating families, but by weaving them into communities. And if that's our inheritance, if that's what we evolved to do, then maybe we're capable of more than we think. Maybe the systems we've built in the last few centuries, systems that prioritize wealth over well-being, individual success over collective care, aren't reflections of human nature. Maybe they're just choices. And choices can change. The first families didn't leave behind written records. They didn't build monuments or empires. But they left something more enduring. They left us. Our capacity for language. Our ability to love beyond blood. Our instinct to teach, to care, to mourn. These aren't cultural accidents. They're evolutionary gifts, shaped over millennia in the valleys, caves, and grasslands of Africa. And the more we uncover about how they lived, the more we realize how much we've forgotten. We've spent centuries building walls between families, between nations, between past and present. But the story of early Africa is a story of connection. Of people who understood that survival wasn't individual. It was collective. That strength wasn't dominance. It was cooperation. That family wasn't a structure. It was a practice. And maybe, just maybe, that's a story worth remembering. There's a San proverb that says, a person is a person through other people. It's a simple idea. But it carries the weight of 300,000 years. Because the people who first spoke languages like that, who first carved symbols into ochre and bone, who first laid their loved ones to rest with care, they knew something we're still trying to relearn. That we're not meant to do this alone. Not as individuals. Not as families. Not as nations. We're meant to do it together. And if we ever forget that, all we have to do is look back. To the caves. To the tools. To the bones. To the first families. Who lived, loved, and built the foundation of everything we are. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe history should be told truthfully and fully, then stay with us. Because Africa's past isn't just untold. It's still being written.